All right, so as we are starting our kind of middle of the unit and we're getting ready for our concept check this week, let's do a quick review. So, in Unit 2, the functions of government, we've talked about several things now. The first thing we talked about was 2.1, where we identified the constitutional principles, so the 6 principles. And just to remind you, okay, our first principle was popular sovereignty, and it held that all power is held by the people, and the power to govern is given through the Constitution, which was and is ratified by the people. The second principle is limited government. And with limited government, the government can only do what the people give it the power to do. Okay, and with limited government, we also have this notion of the rule of law, which means that those who govern must also obey the law. Our third principle is checks and balances, and that just means that each branch is checked by the other branches. And this ensures one branch does not have all of the power. Our fourth principle of the Constitution is separation of powers. And here we see that the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch each have their own powers, and they each have their own kind of job. And so for the legislative branch, they make the laws, all right, and we have representatives and we have senators, and they serve anywhere between 2 or 6 years. We also have the executive branch, which enforces the law. And we know that the executive represents the entire country. And this person serves 4 years or up to 2 terms of 4 years each. And then lastly, we have the judicial branch, which interprets the laws. They represent the Constitution, they serve for life, and they are independent. Our fifth principle is federalism. And that means that some powers are delegated to the national government and some are reserved for the states. Remember, the states have their own laws, their own courts, their own constitutions, and their own elected officials. But under federalism, even though the states have all of those things, they are still bound by federal laws and federal courts and our United States Constitution. Our last principle is judicial review, and that's the power of the court to determine the constitutionality of a law, okay, or a law or an action. And judicial review reminds us of the Supremacy Clause, which means that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So again, our 6 principles of the Constitution are 1, popular sovereignty, 2, limited government, 3, checks and balances, 4, separation of powers, 5, federalism, and 6, judicial. So our second objective for Unit 2 is to identify and analyze the structure of the Constitution. And the structure of the Constitution has 3 main parts. The first is the preamble. All right, that's our statement of purpose, and it tells us 6 things that the Constitution seeks to do. We then have our 7 articles, okay, and that lays out what the power is and how the government is going to be structured. And then we have our 27 amendments, where those are our kind of new portions of the Constitution that have been able to change with the time. So there's 27 total of them. We know that the first 10 are the Bill of Rights. Our third objective for this unit is to identify the powers of the legislative branch. All right, so 2.3 asks us to identify the powers of the legislative branch. And we know that Article 1 of the Constitution lays out kind of all of the ins and outs of the legislative branch. And we know that Article 1 is where the powers of Congress and any limits on those powers are broken down and discussed. So Congress makes up the legislative branch of government, and in turn, they're in charge of making the laws that go into effect. Okay. So when we see that the first article of the Constitution is broken down into 10 distinct sections. Okay, we're going to go through each of the sections quickly. So, Article 1, Section 1 basically says this Constitution, this article vests, okay, or gives Congress the power to create the laws of the U.S. Constitution. And that's a really, really big power. This basically gives Congress, all right, a guideline to what they should be able to do, what kind of laws are going to be passed, what kind of qualifications are going to be. So Section 1 definitely begins by telling us that Article 1, okay, vests Congress with the power to do certain things. So Article 1, Section 2 defines the House of Representatives, okay, and this section provides information about the House of Representatives. It discusses how elections have to be held in order to determine who's going to be part of the House. Right? It tells us that an election is going to take place every second year. It also gives the qualifications for who can be a House member. And here we know that the citizens of each state are in charge of voting in the members of the House of Representatives. And we know that in order to run for a seat on the House of Representatives, an individual has to be at least 25 years old, that they have to be a U.S. citizen, and they must have been in the United States for a period of at least 7 years. And then also they have to live in the state that they wish to represent. Moving on, Article 1, Section 3 tells us about the Senate. We know that each state's going to have 2 senators. This is based on the New Jersey plan. They're going to be appointed for 6 years. And in order for an individual to be voted in, the minimum age to run as a senator is 30 years old. They also have to be a citizen. They have to have lived in the United States for at least 9 years prior to running for the Senate seat. And they also have to live in the state where they are running for their Senate seat. Article 1, Section 4 tells us about elections and meetings. Okay, it tells us kind of when elections are going to be held. Section 5 of Article 1 tells us about memberships and rules and journals and kind of some nitty-gritty rules. Article 6 tells us about compensation and how the Congress is going to be compensated. Article 1, Section 7 tells us how bills are going to be made. It discusses the manner in which Congress creates acts through bills. Okay, it's going to talk about the proposed bill either begins in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, and why one bill would start in either house. It's going to talk about that whole process. So Article 1, Section 7 tells us kind of the bill to law procedure. Article 1, Section 8 tells us about the powers of Congress. And now this section lists the enumerated powers of the Congress. So basically, this is a list of things that Congress can and cannot do. Making money or creating their own tax schedules are a couple of things that Congress does not have the power to do under Article 1, Section 8. Under Article 1, Section 9, these are the limits on Congress. And in this section, the limits are listed like the enumerated powers that Congress has in Section 8. These are things that Congress also cannot do. And then we have Article 1, Section 10, and these are powers prohibited of the states. That means that this final section of Article 1 of the Constitution is the one that puts a limit on the powers that each of the states have. So the first part that is discussed says the states do not have the power to act like or do not have powers like the federal government has. Okay. It discusses what the limits are set forth and how the federal government and all federal laws are always going to trump the state's laws. So it kind of articulates again this notion of the supremacy clause. All right, so next we have 2.4, which is the powers of the executive branch. So Article 2 of the Constitution is where we have kind of the location of the executive branch. And the executive branch is the governmental branch that has the power, responsibility, and authority for administering the United States. And the executive branch includes the president, the vice president, and other executive officers, to include some state officials and other officials at the federal level. So the second article of the U.S. Constitution is broken down into 4 distinct sections. And each of these sections are then broken down into clauses, each one providing rules and guidelines that have to be followed by those members who are a part of the executive branch. Now, the longest of the sections is the first one, and the first section is broken down to 8 clauses. And in these 8 clauses, it basically breaks down the rules governing the president and what their authority is as the president of the United States. So in section 1, again, we're talking about defining the roles of the president and the vice president. And then each clause, again, is going to break down certain powers, restrictions. It's going to define things. So clause 1 of section 1 tells us that the power of the president, okay, is vested in the executive branch. And it defines the term of power for a period of 4 years and assigns that the vice president will also hold his or her office for that same amount of time. We then move to clause 2, and this tells us that electors are going to decide on the president and the vice president. Okay, we're talking about the electoral college. Okay, we're talking about the electoral college. All right, so we then move to clause 3, which talks even more about the electoral college. It also mentions the 12th Amendment and kind of what that does. Then we move to clause 4, which states that Congress decides when the elections for president are held, and that states currently select electors on the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. So clause 4 tells us when our national presidential elections are going to be. Clause 5 of Article 2, Section 1 tells us that the requirements are laid out for the president and the vice president. So it states that a presidential candidate has to be at least 35 years old, must be a natural-born U.S. citizen, and that they must have lived in the United States for a period of 14 years. Clause 6 tells us what happens if the president dies, resigns, or is impeached. So it kind of gives us the line of succession if something happens to the president. Clause 7 tells us how much the president is going to make. And then clause 8 is talking about the oath of office. So it tells us what the president is going to say and what he is going to swear as his oath of office. Next, we have section 2 of Article 2. In this section broadly dictates the powers of the president and only has 3 clauses. So the first clause of section 2 of Article 2 states that the president is the commander-in-chief of the military forces, and that the creation of a cabinet of senior advisors is also going to be established here, and that the president is in charge of making decisions as the commander-in-chief. Clause 2 tells us that the president is required to get advice and consent from the U.S. Congress prior to being able to making final and binding decisions as far as committing troops. Clause 3 tells us that the president has the power to assign certain offices while in power, but this power will end when the next Senate session begins. Now, Article 2, Section 3 basically tells us that the president has certain responsibilities, and this section is broken down into 5 clauses. So Clause 1 requires that the president keeps Congress informed and gives them information through a State of the Union address at regular intervals. Okay, so that the president has to give a State of the Union address. Clause 2 tells us that the power of the president to call sessions of Senate, the president has the power to call sessions of Senate or the House of Representatives for both parties. So the president is allowed to do that. Clause number 3 dictates that the president is responsible for receiving any foreign ambassadors that come to the United States. Clause 4 tells us that the president is required to work to ensure all laws are executed faithfully while in office. So that's his main kind of duty, is that the executive has to enforce all of the laws that the Congress has passed. And then Clause 5 tells us that the president's powers allow him to commission U.S. officers, including those in the military forces, when deemed necessary. All right, our last section of Article 2, so Article 2, Section 4, this has to do with how the president can be disqualified from being in office. And this is basically the impeachment proceedings.